I stood at the door of my grandfather's house in the morning, a vast and ancient door made of Haraz, a door that had doubtless been fashioned from the wood of a whole tree. Wad Basir had made it. Wad Basir, the village engineer who, though he had not even learned carpentry at school, had yet made the wheels and rings of the water wheels, had set bones, had cauterized people and bled with cupping glasses. He was also so knowledgeable about judging donkeys that seldom did anyone from the village buy one without consulting him. Though Wad Basir is still alive today, he no longer makes such doors as that of my grandfather's house. Later generations of villagers having found out about Zan wood doors and iron doors, which they bring in from Omdurman. The market for water wheels too dried up with the coming of pumps. I heard them guffawing with laughter, and made out the thin, mischievous laugh of my grandfather when in a good humor. Wad Rayas's laugh that issues forth from an ever-full stomach. Bakri's that takes its hue and flavor from the company in which he happens to be, and the strong mannish laugh of Bint Majzub. In my mind's eye, I see my grandfather sitting on his prayer mat with his string of sandalwood prayer beads in his hand, revolving in ever constant movement like the buckets of a water wheel. Bint Majzub, Wadrayez, and Bakri, all old friends of his, will be sitting on those low couches which are mere 2 handspans off the floor. According to my grandfather, a couch raised high off the floor indicates vanity, a low one humility. Bint Majzub will be leaning on one elbow, while in her other hand she holds a cigarette. Wad Rayas will be given the impression of producing stories from the tips of his mustaches. Bakri will merely be sitting. This large house is built neither of stone nor yet of red brick, but of the very mud in which the wheat is grown, and it stands right at the edge of the field, so that it is an extension of it. This is evident from the acacia and sant bushes that are grown in the courtyard, and from the plants that sprout from the very walls where the water has seeped through from the cultivated land. It is a chaotic house, built without method, and has acquired its present form over many years. Many differently sized rooms, some built up against one another at different times, either because they were needed or because my grandfather found himself with some spare money for which he had no other use. Some of the rooms lead off one another. Others have doors so low that you have to double up to enter, yet others are doorless. Some have many windows, some none. The walls are smooth and plastered with a mixture of rough sand, black mud, and animal dung. Likewise the roofs, while the ceilings are of acacia wood and palm tree trunks and stalks. A maze of a house, cool in summer, warm in winter. If one looks objectively at it from outside, one feels it to be a frail structure incapable of survival. But somehow, as if by a miracle, it has surmounted time. Entering by the door of this spacious courtyard, I looked to right and to left. Over there were dates spread out on a straw matting to dry. Over there onions and chilies. Over there sacks of wheat and beans. Some with mouths stitched up, others open. In a corner a goat eats barley and suckles her young. The fate of this house is bound up with that of the field. If the field waxes green, so does it. If drought sweeps over the field, it also sweeps over the house. I breathe in that smell peculiar to my grandfather's house, a discordant mixture of onions and chilies and dates and wheat and horse beans and fenugreek. In addition to the aroma of the incense which is always floating up from the large earthenware censer. The aroma of incense puts me in mind of my grandfather's ascetic manner of life and the luxury of his accessories for prayers. The rug on which he prays, made up of 3 leopard skins stitched together, and which he would use as a coverlet when it turned excessively cold. The brass ewer, with its decorations and inscriptions, which he used for his ablutions, and the matching brass basin. He was specially proud of his sandalwood prayer beads, which he would run through his fingers and rub against his face, breathing in their aroma. When he got angry with one of his grandchildren, he would strike him across the head with them, saying that this would chase away the devil that had got into him. All these things, like the rooms of his house and the date palms in his field, had their own histories which my grandfather had recounted to me time and time again, on each occasion adding or omitting something. I lingered by the door as I savored that agreeable sensation which precedes the moment of meeting my grandfather whenever I return from a journey, a sensation of pure astonishment that that ancient being is still in actual existence upon the earth's surface. When I embrace him, I breathe in his unique smell, which is a combination of the smell of the large mausoleum in the cemetery and the smell of an infant child. And that thin, tranquil voice that sets up a bridge between me and the anxious moment that has not yet been formed, and between the moments, the events of which have been assimilated and have passed on, have become bricks in an edifice with perspectives and dimensions. By the standards of European industrial world, we are poor peasants. But when I embrace my grandfather, I experience a sense of richness, as though I am a note in the heartbeats of the very universe. He is no towering oak tree with luxuriant branches growing in a land on which nature has bestowed water and fertility. Rather is he like the sayal bushes in the deserts of the Sudan, thick of bark and sharp of thorn, defeating death because they ask so little of life. That was the cause for wonder, that he was actually alive, despite plague and famines, wars, and the corruption of rulers. And now here he is nearing his 100th year. All his teeth are still intact, though you would think his small, lusterless eyes were sightless. Yet he can see with them in the pitch darkness of night. His body small and shrunken in upon itself is all bones, veins, skin, and muscle, with not a single scrap of fat. Nonetheless, he can spring nimbly onto his donkey and walks from his house to the mosque in the twilight of dawn. My grandfather used the edge of his gown to wipe away the tears that had run down his face from laughing so much, and after giving me time to settle myself in the gathering, said, "By God, that's some story of yours, Wadrayas." This was a cue to Wadrayas to continue the story my entrance had interrupted. "And afterwards, Hajj Ahmed, I put the girl in front of me on the donkey, squirming and twisting. Then I forcibly stripped her of all her clothes till she was as naked as the day her mother bore her. She was a young slave girl from down river who'd just reached puberty. Her breasts, Hajj Ahmed, stuck out like pistols, and your arms wouldn't meet round her buttocks. She had been rubbed all over with oil so that her skin glistened in the moonlight, and her perfume turned one giddy. I took her down to a sandy patch in the middle of the maze. But when I started on her, I heard a movement in the maze and a voice saying, 'Who's there?' Oh, Hajj Ahmed, there's no madness like the madness of youth. Thinking quickly, I made out I was an Afrit and began letting out fiendish shrieks, scattering sand around and stamping about. So the man panicked and fled. The joke was, though, that my Uncle Isa had been following hard on my heels from the moment I snatched the girl from the wedding house, right up to when we arrived at the patch of sand. When he saw I was pretending to be an Afrit, he stood by watching. Early the next day, he went off to my father, may God rest his soul, and told him the whole story. 'This son of yours is a real devil,' he told him, 'and if you don't find him a wife this very day, he'll corrupt the whole village and bring down on us no end of scandals.' And they in fact married me off that very day to my Uncle Rajab's daughter. God rest her soul, she died giving birth to her first child. Since when? Said Bint Masjub to him, laughing in her manly voice, made hoarse by too much smoking. You've been jumping on and off like a jack donkey. Is there anyone who knows the sweetness of this thing better than you, Bint Masjub? Wadraya said to her. You've buried 8 husbands and now you're an old woman and you wouldn't say no if you were offered it. We've heard, said my grandfather, that Bint Masjub's cries of delight had to be heard to be believed. May I divorce, Haj Ahmed, said Bint Masjub, lighting up a cigarette, if when my husband was between my thighs I didn't let out a scream that used to scare the animals tied up at pasture. Bakri, who previously had been laughing without saying anything, said, Tell us, Bint Masjub, which of your husbands was the best? Wad Bashir, said Bint Masjub promptly. Wad Bashir the dozy dope, said Bakri. He was so slow a goat could make off with his supper. May I divorce, said Bint Masjub, freeing the ash from her cigarette onto the ground with a theatrical movement of her fingers. If his thing wasn't like a wedge, he'd drive right into me, so that I could hardly contain myself. He'd lift up my legs after the evening prayers, and I'd remain splayed open till the call to prayers at dawn. When he had his climax, he'd shout like an ox being slaughtered, and always when moving from on top of me, he would say, Praise be to God, Bint Masjub. It's not surprising you killed him off in the bloom of youth, said my grandfather to her. The time that fate decreed for him killed him, said Bint Masjub with a laugh. This business never kills anyone. Bint Masjub was a tall woman of a charcoal complexion like black velvet, who, despite the fact she was approaching 70, still retained vestiges of beauty. She was famous in the village, and men and women alike were eager to listen to her conversation, which was daring and uninhibited. She used to smoke, drink, and swear an oath of divorce like a man. It was said that her mother was the daughter of one of the first sultans in Darfur. She had been married to a number of the leading men of the village, all of whom had died and left her a considerable fortune. She had borne 1 son and a countless number of daughters who were famous for their beauty and for being as uninhibited in their conversation as their mother. It was recounted that one of Bint Masjub's daughters married a man of whom her mother did not approve. He took her off on a journey with him, and on his return about a year later, he decided to hold a banquet to which to invite his wife's relatives. My mother is quite uninhibited in the way she talks, the wife said to him, and it would be better to invite her on her own. So they slaughtered some animals and invited her alone. After she had eaten and drunk, Bint Masjub said to her daughter in her husband's hearing, Amna, this man has not done badly by you, for your house is beautiful, and so is your clothing, and he has filled your hands and neck with gold. However, it would not appear from the look of him that he is able to satisfy you in bed. Now, if you want to have a real satisfaction, and I can find you a husband who, once he mounts you, you will not get off till you're at your last grasp. When the husband heard these words, he was so angry he divorced his wife irrevocably on the spot. What's come over you? Bint Masjub said to Wadrayas. For 2 years now you've contented yourself with a single wife. Has your prowess waned? Wadrayas and my grandfather exchanged glances, the meaning of which I was to understand only later. The face is that of an old man, the heart that of a young one, said Wadrayas. Do you know of a widow or divorced woman who would suit me? By God, the truth is, Wadrayas, said Bakri, that you're past your marrying again. You're now an old man in your 70s and your grandchildren have children of their own. Aren't you ashamed of yourself having a wedding every year? What you need now is to bear yourself with dignity and prepare to meet the Almighty God. Bint Masjub and my grandfather both laughed at these words. What do you understand of these matters? Said Wadrayas in feigned anger. Both you and Haj Ahmed made do with one woman, and when they died and left you, you couldn't find the courage to marry again. Hajj Ahmed here spends all day praying and telling his beads as though paradise had been created just for him. And you, Bakri, busy yourself in making money till death gives you release from it. Almighty God sanctioned marriage, and He sanctioned divorce. Take them with liberality and separate from them with liberality. He said, women and children are the adornments of life on this earth. God said in His noble book. I said to Wadrayas that the Quran did not say women and children, but wealth and children. He answered, in any case, there is no pleasure like that of fornication.